Question 1. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a firearm owner attempting to circumvent the mandatory psychological evaluation for their Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU) permit in Argentina by presenting a forged medical certificate. Which of the following actions best addresses this identified risk while upholding the integrity of the CLU permit process? Option A. Implement a protocol for direct verification of all submitted medical and psychological certificates with the issuing professionals or institutions. Option B. Accept all submitted medical certificates without independent verification, assuming applicants are acting in good faith. Option C. Immediately deny any application where a medical certificate is submitted, pending further investigation that may take several months. Option D. Outsource the verification of all medical certificates to an external agency without establishing internal oversight. Correct answer is A. Implement a protocol for direct verification of all submitted medical and psychological certificates with the issuing professionals or institutions. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a firearm owner attempting to circumvent the mandatory psychological evaluation for their Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU) permit in Argentina by presenting a forged medical certificate. This scenario is professionally challenging because it places the applicant in a position of potential deception and the licensing authority in a position of needing to verify authenticity without unduly burdening legitimate applicants. It requires careful judgment to balance security concerns with procedural fairness. The best professional approach involves diligently verifying the authenticity of all submitted documentation, including medical and psychological certificates, through direct contact with the issuing professionals or institutions. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the identified risk of forged documents by implementing a robust verification process. It aligns with the ethical obligation of licensing authorities to ensure public safety by preventing unqualified individuals from obtaining firearms. Furthermore, it upholds the integrity of the CLU permit system, which is designed to ensure that only individuals who meet specific legal and psychological criteria are granted the privilege of firearm ownership in Argentina. This proactive verification is a fundamental aspect of responsible firearm regulation. An incorrect approach would be to accept the submitted medical certificate at face value without any independent verification, assuming the applicant is acting in good faith. This fails to mitigate the identified risk of forgery and could lead to a CLU permit being issued to an individual who does not meet the required psychological standards, thereby compromising public safety. Ethically, this approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the application based on suspicion alone, without attempting any verification. While vigilance is important, an immediate denial without due process or an opportunity to clarify or provide further evidence can be seen as procedurally unfair and potentially discriminatory. It does not align with the principle of providing a fair hearing or opportunity to comply with requirements. A further incorrect approach would be to outsource the verification process entirely to a third-party service without establishing clear oversight or quality control mechanisms. While outsourcing can be efficient, the ultimate responsibility for the integrity of the CLU permit issuance rests with the licensing authority. A lack of direct oversight could still allow forged documents to pass through undetected. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes risk assessment, adherence to established procedures, and ethical considerations. This involves understanding the specific requirements of the CLU permit regulations in Argentina, identifying potential vulnerabilities in the application process, and implementing proportionate verification measures. When faced with potential red flags, the process should involve a systematic approach to verification, seeking clarification from the applicant, and consulting with issuing professionals or institutions, all while maintaining procedural fairness and respecting the applicant's rights. Question 2. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina, has submitted an application with several required documents missing, stating they will provide them shortly. What is the most appropriate professional course of action? Option A. Accept the incomplete application and initiate the permit process, advising the applicant to submit the remaining documents as soon as possible. Option B. suggests that the applicant explore informal channels or personal contacts to potentially bypass certain documentation requirements for their CLU. Option C. Advise the applicant on how to present the existing, incomplete documentation in a manner that might expedite the review process, hoping the authorities overlook the missing items. Option D. Inform the applicant that the application cannot be processed until all mandatory documentation, as per Argentine federal and provincial regulations, is submitted in its entirety. The correct answer is D. Inform the applicant that the application cannot be processed until all mandatory documentation, as per Argentine federal and provincial regulations, is submitted in its entirety. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire and the strict legal requirements for obtaining and maintaining a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina. The applicant's eagerness to expedite the process, coupled with their incomplete documentation, creates pressure to bypass established procedures. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the Argentine legal framework governing firearms permits and a commitment to ethical conduct, prioritizing legal compliance over client convenience. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and unequivocally informing the applicant about the mandatory requirements for obtaining a CLU as stipulated by Argentine law. This includes explaining that all necessary documentation, such as proof of identity, criminal record certificates, and any other documents mandated by the relevant national and provincial authorities, must be submitted in their entirety and in the correct format before the application can be processed. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal framework governing firearms permits in Argentina, ensuring that the application process is conducted lawfully and transparently. It upholds the integrity of the system designed to regulate firearm ownership and prevent misuse, aligning with ethical obligations to both the client and public safety. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the incomplete application with the promise of submitting the missing documents later, while initiating the permit process. This is professionally unacceptable because it violates the fundamental requirement of a complete application for the CLU. Argentine regulations are clear that incomplete submissions are grounds for rejection or delay, and attempting to circumvent this by initiating processing is a breach of procedural integrity and potentially illegal. Another incorrect approach is to advise the applicant on how to present the existing, incomplete documentation in a way that might mislead the authorities into believing the application is more complete than it is. This is ethically reprehensible and legally unsound. It constitutes an attempt to deceive the regulatory body and undermines the trust placed in professionals to uphold the law. Such actions could lead to severe penalties for both the applicant and the professional, including the revocation of the CLU and professional sanctions. A further incorrect approach is to suggest that the applicant might be able to obtain a temporary permit or bypass certain requirements through informal channels or personal connections. This is highly problematic as it implies the existence of unofficial or corrupt practices, which are antithetical to the principles of a regulated and lawful system. It also exposes the applicant to significant risks, as any permit obtained through such means would likely be invalid and could have serious legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with CLU applications in Argentina must adopt a decision-making framework rooted in strict adherence to the law and ethical principles. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding all current legal requirements for the CLU, including any provincial variations. 2. Communicating these requirements clearly and comprehensively to the applicant. 3. Insisting on the submission of all mandated documentation before proceeding with any part of the application process. 4. Refusing any requests or suggestions that involve circumventing legal procedures or misrepresenting information. 5. Maintaining professional integrity by prioritizing legal compliance and public safety above client expediency. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a financial advisor in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to assist a client who wishes to acquire a firearm for personal protection, but is impatient with the standard application process for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU. The client asks if there are shortcuts or ways to speed things up through unofficial channels. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Inform the client that the mandatory training courses and psychological evaluations are often negotiable and can be minimized to save time. Option B. Recommend that the client purchase the firearm first and then initiate the CLU application, assuring them that the process will likely be completed before any issues arise. Option C. Suggest the client leverage personal acquaintances within the Argentine National Registry of Firearm Possession, RENAR, or local police to expedite the background check and approval stages of the CLU application. Option D. Advise the client that the CLU application process must be followed strictly as per Argentine law, explaining the required steps, documentation, and timelines, and offer to assist in gathering the necessary paperwork and preparing for the required evaluations. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that the CLU application process must be followed strictly as per Argentine law, explaining the required steps, documentation, and timelines, and offer to assist in gathering the necessary paperwork and preparing for the required evaluations. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape to ensure compliance and ethical conduct. In Argentina, the process of obtaining and maintaining a Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, is governed by specific laws and regulations designed to ensure responsible firearm ownership. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential conflict between a client's immediate desire and the strict legal requirements for firearm permits, demanding careful judgment to uphold both professional integrity and legal obligations. The best professional approach involves prioritizing adherence to the established legal framework for obtaining a CLU in Argentina. This means guiding the client through the official application process, ensuring all required documentation, background checks, and training are completed as mandated by Argentine law. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the purpose of the CLU, which is to ensure that only individuals who meet specific legal criteria are authorized to possess firearms, thereby promoting public safety and responsible gun ownership as intended by the regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach would be to advise the client to circumvent or expedite the official process by suggesting they use personal connections within law enforcement or administrative offices to bypass standard procedures. This is ethically and legally unacceptable because it undermines the integrity of the CLU system, potentially placing firearms in the hands of individuals who have not met the required safety and suitability standards. Such an action would violate the spirit and letter of Argentine firearm regulations, which are designed to be impartial and merit-based. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest the client acquire a firearm without a valid CLU, perhaps on the premise that they intend to apply for one soon. This is a direct violation of Argentine law, which strictly prohibits firearm possession without a valid permit. It exposes both the client and the advisor to severe legal penalties and creates an immediate public safety risk. A third incorrect approach would be to downplay the importance of the required training or psychological evaluations, suggesting they are mere formalities that can be glossed over. This is dangerous and unethical, as these requirements are integral to assessing a user's suitability and ensuring they understand safe firearm handling and storage. Failing to emphasize their importance compromises the safety objectives of the CLU system. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant laws and regulations governing firearm permits in Argentina. When faced with a client's request, the first step is to assess its legality and ethical implications. If the request involves actions that contravene regulations, the professional's duty is to inform the client of the legal requirements and guide them towards compliant solutions, even if it means delaying their immediate objective. Transparency, honesty, and a commitment to upholding the law are paramount in such situations. Question 4. Cost-benefit analysis shows that submitting an incomplete or potentially inaccurate application for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina might seem to save time and effort in the short term. However, considering the legal and ethical ramifications, what is the most responsible course of action for an applicant who discovers a minor but significant discrepancy in their submitted documentation before the permit is issued? Option A. Seek advice from an acquaintance who claims to know how to fix such issues informally to avoid official channels. Option B. Proceed with the application, hoping the discrepancy will not be noticed, and address it only if directly questioned by the authorities. Option C. Attempt to discreetly alter the original documentation to match the intended information without informing the authorities. Option D. Immediately contact the relevant Argentine authorities to report the discrepancy and provide corrected information or an explanation. The correct answer is D. Immediately contact the relevant Argentine authorities to report the discrepancy and provide corrected information or an explanation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearms permit applicant in Argentina who is aware of a potential discrepancy in their application documentation. The challenge lies in balancing the legal obligation to provide truthful and accurate information with the personal desire to obtain the permit. Misrepresenting information, even if seemingly minor, can have serious legal and ethical consequences, including the denial of the permit and potential criminal charges. The applicant must navigate this situation with integrity and adherence to Argentine law regarding firearm ownership. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively and truthfully disclosing the discrepancy to the relevant authorities. This approach aligns with the principles of honesty and transparency mandated by Argentine law for obtaining and maintaining a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CCW. Article 10 of Law 25/917, National Arms Registry Law, and its implementing decrees emphasize the importance of accurate information in the application process. By coming forward, the applicant demonstrates good faith and allows the authorities to make an informed decision based on complete information, potentially leading to a corrected application or a clear understanding of the situation. This proactive disclosure is ethically sound and legally prudent, minimizing future complications. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to disclose the discrepancy and proceeding with the application as if no issue exists is ethically and legally unacceptable. This constitutes a misrepresentation of facts, violating the principle of truthfulness required by the CLU application process. Such an omission could be interpreted as an attempt to deceive the authorities, leading to the immediate denial of the permit and potential blacklisting from future applications. Attempting to rectify the discrepancy independently without informing the authorities, such as by altering documents or fabricating supporting evidence, is also a serious ethical and legal violation. This constitutes fraud and forgery, which are criminal offenses in Argentina, and would undoubtedly result in the denial of the permit and severe legal repercussions. Seeking advice from an unauthorized individual or entity to circumvent the official process is likewise unprofessional and risky. While seeking advice is generally good, relying on individuals who may not be fully versed in Argentine firearms law or who suggest illicit methods can lead to further complications and legal trouble, undermining the integrity of the CLU application. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should always prioritize honesty and adherence to the specific legal framework governing the permit. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements for the CLU in Argentina, including the obligation to provide accurate information. 2. Identifying any potential discrepancies or omissions in the application. 3. Proactively and truthfully disclosing any such issues to the relevant Argentine authorities responsible for issuing the CLU. 4. Cooperating fully with the authorities to resolve the discrepancy. This methodical approach ensures compliance, maintains ethical standards, and protects the applicant from future legal entanglements. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates that an applicant for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina has a history of a domestic violence incident that did not result in a criminal conviction. The applicant is unsure whether to disclose this incident on their application, as they believe it does not legally disqualify them. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation ethically and in compliance with Argentine firearm regulations? Option A. Omit the domestic violence incident from the application, assuming that only criminal convictions are relevant for CLU eligibility. Option B. Assume that because the incident did not lead to a criminal conviction, it is irrelevant and does not need to be mentioned in any context related to the CLU application. Option C. Fully disclose the domestic violence incident to the Directorate General of Material Security (DI, GSMA), and provide any supporting documentation or explanation requested. Option D. Downplay the severity of the domestic violence incident when discussing it with the DI, GSMA, focusing only on the lack of a conviction. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the domestic violence incident to the Directorate General of Material Security (DI, GSMA), and provide any supporting documentation or explanation requested. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the strict legal requirements for obtaining and maintaining a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina with the ethical obligation to report potentially disqualifying information. The applicant's history of domestic violence, even if not resulting in a criminal conviction that would automatically disqualify them, raises significant safety concerns that must be addressed transparently and responsibly. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the spirit and letter of the law concerning good conduct and the potential risk posed by an applicant. The best professional approach involves proactively disclosing the domestic violence incident to the relevant authorities when applying for or renewing a CLU. This demonstrates honesty and a commitment to upholding the integrity of the firearms licensing system. By providing full disclosure, the applicant allows the Directorate General of Material Security (DI, GSMA) to conduct a thorough assessment of their suitability, considering all relevant factors, including the nature of the incident, the time elapsed, and any evidence of rehabilitation or ongoing risk. This approach aligns with the ethical duty of candor and the legal requirement to provide accurate information on the application. It also respects the DI, GSMA's mandate to ensure that only responsible individuals are granted permits to possess firearms, thereby safeguarding public safety. An incorrect approach would be to omit the domestic violence incident from the application, hoping it goes unnoticed. This constitutes a failure to provide truthful information, which is a direct violation of the application requirements and can lead to the denial or revocation of the CLU. Ethically, it is a breach of trust and demonstrates a lack of respect for the regulatory process. Furthermore, if discovered, it could result in severe penalties, including fines and potential criminal charges. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because there was no criminal conviction, the incident is irrelevant and need not be disclosed. While a conviction is a clear disqualifier, the concept of good conduct, buena conducta, required for a CLU is broader than just the absence of criminal convictions. It encompasses an assessment of an individual's general behavior and their propensity to misuse firearms. Domestic violence, regardless of conviction status, can be indicative of behavioral issues that raise concerns about responsible firearm ownership. Failing to disclose it based on the absence of a conviction ignores this broader interpretation and the DI, GSMA's responsibility to assess risk. Finally, attempting to downplay the severity of the incident or provide misleading information about it would also be an unacceptable approach. This is a form of dishonesty that undermines the application process and demonstrates a lack of integrity. It is crucial to present factual information and allow the authorities to make an informed decision. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the specific legal requirements and ethical obligations. When in doubt about the relevance of past incidents, it is always best to err on the side of transparency and disclose the information. This allows for a proper assessment by the designated authorities and demonstrates a commitment to responsible conduct. Professionals should consider the potential impact of their actions on public safety and the integrity of the regulatory system. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates that a registered legitimate user of firearms in Argentina has not updated their residential address in the official registry for over 2 years, despite a recent attempt by the registry to contact them at their old address regarding a routine permit renewal. Considering the legal framework for the Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the registry official? Option A. Grant an immediate verbal assurance to the applicant that their renewal is approved, contingent on them updating their address within 48 hours. Option B. Initiate a formal administrative process to address the failure to report a change of address, including notifying the individual of the violation and providing an opportunity to explain or rectify the situation before considering any action on the CLU. Option C. Proceed with the permit renewal, assuming the individual will update their address at a later time, and make a note of the discrepancy. Option D. Immediately revoke the Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego due to the violation of reporting obligations. Correct answer is B. Initiate a formal administrative process to address the failure to report a change of address, including notifying the individual of the violation and providing an opportunity to explain or rectify the situation before considering any action on the CLU. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearms registry official in Argentina. The challenge lies in balancing the strict requirements for obtaining and maintaining a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, with the potential for a legitimate user to experience temporary personal circumstances that might affect their ability to meet ongoing obligations. The official must navigate the legal framework governing CLU holders, while also considering the ethical implications of enforcing regulations in a manner that is both just and effective in ensuring public safety. The core tension is between upholding the letter of the law and applying it with a degree of reasoned discretion when circumstances warrant, without compromising the integrity of the firearms control system. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's situation against the specific requirements outlined in Argentine law for CLU renewal and the reporting obligations of CLU holders. This includes verifying if the applicant has proactively communicated any changes in their circumstances that might impact their eligibility, or if they have failed to meet a mandatory reporting requirement. If the applicant has indeed failed to report a change in address, which is a direct violation of their obligation as a CLU holder under Argentine regulations, e.g. Ley N Degrees 25/994 and its implementing decrees, the official must follow the established administrative procedures for addressing such noncompliance. This typically involves issuing a formal notification, requesting an explanation, and if the explanation is insufficient or the violation is deemed significant, initiating the process for potential suspension or revocation of the CLU, while ensuring due process is followed. This approach prioritizes adherence to the law, public safety, and the applicant's right to respond to allegations of noncompliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately revoke the CLU based solely on the discovery of an outdated address, without any attempt to contact the individual or understand the circumstances. This fails to uphold the principle of due process, which is fundamental in administrative proceedings. Argentine law generally requires notification and an opportunity to be heard before a permit can be revoked. Furthermore, it overlooks the possibility that the failure to update the address might have been an oversight rather than a deliberate attempt to evade authorities or a sign of disqualifying instability. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the outdated address and proceed with the renewal without addressing the violation. This undermines the integrity of the registry and the regulatory framework, designed to ensure that CLU holders remain in good standing and can be reliably contacted. It creates a loophole in the system and potentially compromises public safety by allowing individuals to hold firearms permits without adhering to basic reporting requirements. A third incorrect approach would be to grant an immediate renewal based on a verbal assurance from the applicant that they will update their address later, without any formal process or documentation. This bypasses established procedures and creates an unreliable record. It also fails to address the existing violation of the reporting obligation, setting a precedent for lax enforcement and potentially encouraging future noncompliance by other CLU holders. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, they must clearly understand the specific legal obligations of CLU holders in Argentina, including reporting requirements for changes in personal details. Second, when a discrepancy is identified, they should consult the relevant regulations to determine the precise nature of the violation and the prescribed administrative steps. Third, they must prioritize communication with the individual, providing them with clear notice of the issue and an opportunity to provide an explanation or rectify the situation. Fourth, all actions taken must be documented meticulously, ensuring that the process adheres to principles of fairness, transparency, and due process as mandated by Argentine law. This structured approach ensures that decisions are legally sound, ethically defensible, and contribute to the overall effectiveness of firearms regulation. Question 7. The audit findings indicate that a firearms permit holder in Argentina has requested an extension for their Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU) due to a prolonged personal illness that has prevented them from completing the renewal process within the stipulated timeframe. The applicant has provided medical documentation, but the auditor notes that the specific wording of the law regarding extensions for illness is open to interpretation regarding the duration and severity required for eligibility. How should the auditor proceed to ensure compliance with Argentine regulations and ethical standards? Option A. Advise the applicant to seek a legal opinion on their situation and then make a decision based on that opinion, without independently verifying the medical claims or the applicability of Argentine law. Option B. Deny the extension immediately, citing the applicant's failure to meet the renewal deadline, and advise them to reapply from scratch if they wish to obtain a new CLU. Option C. Grant the extension based on the applicant's stated hardship and the provided medical documentation, assuming that any illness preventing renewal warrants an extension under Argentine law. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the provided medical documentation, cross-referencing it with the specific legal provisions in Argentina concerning CLU extensions for illness, and seek clarification from the relevant regulatory authority if the interpretation of the law remains ambiguous. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the provided medical documentation, cross-referencing it with the specific legal provisions in Argentina concerning CLU extensions for illness, and seek clarification from the relevant regulatory authority if the interpretation of the law remains ambiguous. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential ethical conflict arising from a legitimate firearms user permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, holder's request for an extension due to circumstances that may not strictly align with the established regulatory criteria in Argentina. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's stated needs against the stringent requirements of firearm ownership regulations, which are designed for public safety and responsible gun ownership. The auditor must exercise careful judgment to uphold the integrity of the CLU system without being unduly influenced by personal sympathy or pressure. The best professional approach involves a thorough, objective review of the applicant's request against the specific provisions of Argentine law governing CLU extensions. This means meticulously examining the documentation provided to ascertain if the reasons presented for the extension genuinely meet the legal thresholds for granting such a reprieve. The focus must remain on verifiable facts and adherence to the regulatory framework, ensuring that any decision is defensible and consistent with the principles of public safety and lawful firearm possession. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and objective assessment, which are fundamental ethical obligations for anyone involved in the administration of firearm permits. It avoids subjective interpretations and ensures that the process is fair and transparent, upholding the credibility of the CLU system. An incorrect approach would be to grant the extension based solely on the applicant's personal narrative or perceived hardship, without independently verifying that the circumstances meet the legal criteria for an extension. This bypasses the regulatory requirements and introduces an element of subjectivity that could compromise public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the request outright without a comprehensive review, potentially overlooking valid reasons that might, upon closer inspection, satisfy the legal requirements. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could be perceived as an arbitrary denial. Finally, attempting to find a loophole or bending the rules to accommodate the applicant, even with good intentions, undermines the rule of law and the integrity of the CLU system, creating a precedent for future noncompliance. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant Argentine laws and regulations pertaining to CLU extensions. This should be followed by an objective assessment of all submitted evidence, seeking independent verification where necessary. Any decision must be documented thoroughly, with clear reasoning that references the specific legal provisions applied. If there is any ambiguity, seeking guidance from legal counsel or a superior within the regulatory body is a prudent step to ensure compliance and ethical conduct. Question 8. Implementation of the Legitimate User of Firearms Permit (CLU) application process in Argentina requires strict adherence to specific documentation and procedural requirements. Considering the regulatory framework established by RENAR, which of the following approaches best ensures a successful and compliant application for a CLU? Option A. Meticulously gathering all required documentation as outlined by RENAR regulations, ensuring all personal identification is current, providing proof of address, submitting a valid certificate of good conduct, and completing all mandated forms, along with demonstrating technical aptitude through required evaluations. Option B. Relying on general knowledge of firearms and assuming that formal theoretical and practical evaluations mandated by RENAR are unnecessary if the applicant has prior experience. Option C. Submitting an application with incomplete personal documentation, such as an expired identity card or a missing certificate of good conduct, assuming RENAR will request the missing items later. Option D. Submitting documents that have not been properly legalized or translated if they are foreign issued, believing that RENAR will accept them at face value. The correct answer is A. Meticulously gathering all required documentation as outlined by RENAR regulations, ensuring all personal identification is current, providing proof of address, submitting a valid certificate of good conduct, and completing all mandated forms, along with demonstrating technical aptitude through required evaluations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate complex administrative procedures and demonstrate compliance with specific legal requirements for firearm ownership in Argentina. The Legitimate User of Firearms Permit (CLU) application process involves verifying personal suitability, technical knowledge, and responsible intent, all of which are subject to strict interpretation by the Directorate General of Material Security, RENAR. Failure to adhere precisely to the stipulated documentation and procedural steps can lead to delays, rejection, and potential legal repercussions. The professional challenge lies in ensuring all information is accurate, complete, and presented in the prescribed manner to satisfy RENAR's stringent criteria. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously gathering all required documentation as outlined by RENAR regulations for the CLU application. This includes ensuring the applicant's identity documents are current, providing proof of address, submitting a certificate of good conduct, Certificado de Antecedentes Penales, and completing the specific forms mandated by RENAR. Furthermore, it requires demonstrating the applicant's technical aptitude and understanding of firearm safety through the appropriate means, such as passing a theoretical and practical exam if required by current RENAR directives. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the explicit legal and administrative requirements for obtaining a CLU in Argentina, minimizing the risk of rejection due to procedural errors or incomplete submissions. Adherence to these specific mandates ensures the applicant meets the established standards for responsible firearm ownership as defined by Argentine law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to submit an application with incomplete personal documentation, such as an expired identity card or a missing certificate of good conduct. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly violates the fundamental requirements for establishing identity and legal standing as stipulated by RENAR. The absence of these core documents renders the application invalid from the outset, demonstrating a lack of diligence and disregard for the legal framework governing firearm permits. Another incorrect approach is to assume that general knowledge of firearms is sufficient without undertaking the specific theoretical and practical evaluations mandated by RENAR. This is professionally unsound, as it bypasses the established procedures designed to assess an applicant's competency and understanding of safe firearm handling and storage. Relying on informal knowledge rather than formal assessment fails to meet the regulatory standard for demonstrating legitimate user status. A further incorrect approach is to submit documentation that has not been properly legalized or translated if required by RENAR for foreign-issued documents. This is professionally deficient because it demonstrates a failure to understand and comply with the specific evidentiary requirements for foreign applicants. Such omissions can lead to the rejection of the application due to the inability of RENAR to verify the authenticity and legal standing of the submitted evidence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and thorough approach to CLU applications. This involves consulting the most current RENAR regulations and guidelines, creating a detailed checklist of all required documents and assessments, and verifying the validity and accuracy of each item before submission. A proactive stance, including seeking clarification from RENAR if any aspect of the application process is unclear, is crucial. Professionals must prioritize strict adherence to the legal framework and administrative procedures to ensure a successful and compliant application, thereby upholding the principles of responsible firearm ownership and public safety as mandated by Argentine law. Question 9. To address the challenge of processing a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU) application in Argentina, where the applicant has submitted a form with a section regarding their declared need for a firearm left blank, what is the most appropriate course of action for the firearms registry official? Option A. Immediately reject the application due to the incomplete information, without providing the applicant an opportunity to amend it. Option B. Approve the application based on the assumption that the applicant will provide the missing information at a later stage if it becomes relevant. Option C. Request the applicant to complete the blank section of the application form, specifying their declared need for a firearm, and provide any supporting documentation if required by law. Option D. Proceed with the application, assuming the applicant's need is implied by their desire to obtain a CLU, and move to the next stage of the vetting process. The correct answer is C. Request the applicant to complete the blank section of the application form, specifying their declared need for a firearm, and provide any supporting documentation if required by law. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements of the Argentine Legitimate User of Firearms Permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, process, while dealing with a potentially incomplete or misleading application. The core challenge lies in ensuring compliance with the law and preventing the issuance of a permit to someone who may not meet the stringent criteria, thereby upholding public safety and the integrity of the firearms registry. Careful judgment is required to balance the applicant's right to apply with the state's responsibility to regulate firearm ownership. The correct approach involves diligently verifying all submitted documentation against the requirements stipulated by Argentine law for the CLU. This means actively seeking clarification or additional evidence when information is missing or ambiguous, rather than making assumptions or proceeding with incomplete data. Specifically, this entails requesting the applicant to provide the missing documentation or explanation that directly addresses the identified gaps in their application, ensuring that all legal prerequisites are met before the permit can be considered. This is correct because Argentine law, as outlined in relevant decrees and resolutions governing firearms possession, mandates a thorough vetting process. The principle of legitimate user implies a demonstrable need and the fulfillment of all personal, psychological, and technical requirements. Proceeding without complete information would violate the spirit and letter of these regulations, potentially leading to the issuance of a permit to an unqualified individual. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the application based on the assumption that the applicant will eventually provide the missing information or that the existing information is sufficient, despite clear indications to the contrary. This bypasses the mandatory verification steps and risks approving an application that does not meet legal standards. Another incorrect approach is to deny the application outright without giving the applicant an opportunity to rectify the deficiencies. While diligence is crucial, the process should allow for reasonable requests for clarification or supplementary documentation, provided the applicant is cooperative and the initial submission was not fundamentally flawed. This approach fails to adhere to procedural fairness and the established process for obtaining a CLU, which typically allows for correction of minor omissions. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and public safety. This involves a systematic review of each application against the legal checklist for CLU issuance. When discrepancies or omissions are identified, the framework dictates a clear protocol for addressing them, Communicate the specific deficiencies to the applicant, clearly outlining what is required and providing a reasonable timeframe for submission. If the applicant fails to provide the necessary information after such a request, then a decision to deny the application can be made based on noncompliance. This structured approach ensures fairness, transparency, and adherence to the law, while also serving the overarching goal of responsible firearm regulation. Question 10. The review process indicates an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina has a prior administrative sanction for a minor infraction related to public order that occurred 3 years ago. The applicant has otherwise maintained a clean record since. If the applicant's total expenses related to the permit application process, including fees, background checks, and required training, amount to ARS 50,000, and the average cost of a firearm suitable for self-defense is ARS 250,000, what is the minimum total investment required for the applicant to become a licensed firearm owner, assuming they purchase the firearm immediately after permit approval? Option A, Rs 250,000. Option B, Rs 300,000. Option C, Rs 350,000. Option D, Rs 50,000. The correct answer is B, Rs 300,000. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario where an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina has a prior administrative sanction for a minor infraction related to public order. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced interpretation of the applicant's suitability, balancing the general requirements for firearm ownership against the specific nature and recency of the prior sanction. The decision-making process must strictly adhere to Argentine law, particularly Law No. 25-085, National Registry of Firearm Possession and Tenancy RENAR, and its implementing decrees, which govern the issuance of CLUs. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the applicant's current suitability, considering the nature of the previous sanction and its potential impact on their capacity to responsibly possess firearms. This entails evaluating whether the prior administrative sanction, even if minor, demonstrates a pattern of behavior or a lack of respect for regulations that would disqualify them under Article 4, Paragraph F of Law No. 25-085, which requires applicants to not have impediments of a legal or mental nature. A key factor is the recency of the sanction and any evidence of rehabilitation or changed behavior. If the sanction is old, minor in nature, and the applicant has otherwise demonstrated responsible conduct, a careful and documented assessment could lead to approval, provided all other requirements are met. This aligns with the principle of individualized assessment mandated by the law, which does not automatically disqualify all individuals with prior administrative sanctions, but requires a case-by-case review of their suitability. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the permit solely based on the existence of any prior administrative sanction, regardless of its nature, age, or the applicant's subsequent conduct. This fails to comply with the spirit and letter of Law No. 25-085, which requires a determination of impediments rather than a blanket prohibition. Such an approach would be overly rigid and potentially unjust. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the permit without any specific consideration of the prior sanction, treating it as irrelevant. This would be a failure to exercise due diligence and could contravene the regulatory requirement to assess the applicant's overall suitability and absence of legal impediments. The existence of a sanction, however minor, warrants at least a documented review to confirm it does not constitute an impediment. A further incorrect approach would be to approve the permit based on an assumption that administrative sanctions are always minor and inconsequential for firearm licensing. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the potential implications of even minor infractions on an individual's judgment and respect for legal frameworks, which are critical for responsible firearm ownership. The professional decision-making framework for such situations should involve 1. A comprehensive review of all submitted documentation. 2. A specific inquiry into the nature, date, and resolution of any prior administrative sanctions. 3. An assessment of whether the sanction constitutes a legal or mental impediment as defined by Law No. 25-085. 4. Consideration of any evidence of rehabilitation or changed behavior presented by the applicant. 5. A documented justification for the final decision, ensuring it is consistent with Argentine firearm regulations and promotes public safety. Question 11. Examination of the data shows that an applicant for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina has submitted an application form that appears to be mostly complete, but a section related to their declared firearm ownership history seems to have some ambiguous entries. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Argentine firearms regulations? Option A. Request a detailed personal history report from the applicant, including information beyond their declared firearm ownership, to gain a more comprehensive understanding of their suitability for a CLU. Option B. Thoroughly review all submitted documentation against the explicit requirements of Argentine law for obtaining a CLU, and if ambiguities are found in the firearm ownership history section, request clarification and any necessary supporting documentation from the applicant to ensure all legal criteria are met. Option C. Approve the CLU application, assuming the ambiguous entries in the firearm ownership history are minor and do not fundamentally disqualify the applicant, to expedite the process. Option D. Immediately reject the CLU application due to the ambiguous entries in the firearm ownership history, as incomplete or unclear information indicates a lack of diligence on the part of the applicant. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly review all submitted documentation against the explicit requirements of Argentine law for obtaining a CLU, and if ambiguities are found in the firearm ownership history section, request clarification and any necessary supporting documentation from the applicant to ensure all legal criteria are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements of the Argentine firearms permit system, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, while dealing with a potentially incomplete or misleading application. The challenge lies in ensuring compliance with the law without causing undue prejudice to the applicant or compromising the integrity of the permitting process. A careful judgment is required to balance thoroughness with efficiency. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all submitted documentation against the explicit requirements of Argentine law for obtaining a CLU. This includes verifying the completeness of the application form, ensuring all supporting documents, such as proof of identity, residence, and any required psychological or aptitude assessments, are present and correctly filled out, and confirming that the applicant meets all eligibility criteria as stipulated by the relevant Argentine legislation. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal framework governing CLU issuance, ensuring that only qualified individuals are granted permits, thereby upholding public safety and the rule of law. It prioritizes regulatory compliance and due diligence. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to approve the application based on the assumption that the missing information is not critical, or to proceed without obtaining clarification. This fails to meet the legal standard for a CLU, as Argentine law mandates specific documentation and criteria for eligibility. Approving an incomplete application risks issuing a permit to someone who may not fully meet the legal requirements, potentially compromising public safety and violating the spirit and letter of the law. Another incorrect approach is to immediately reject the application without providing the applicant an opportunity to rectify any deficiencies. While thoroughness is crucial, Argentine administrative procedures often allow for applicants to correct errors or provide missing documentation. An outright rejection without such an opportunity could be seen as procedurally unfair and may not align with the principles of administrative justice, even if the initial submission was flawed. A further incorrect approach is to request additional, non-statutory information that is not required by Argentine law for a CLU. This can create unnecessary burdens for the applicant, delay the process, and potentially lead to accusations of arbitrary or discriminatory practices. The focus must remain strictly on the legally defined requirements for the permit. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a systematic decision-making framework. First, they must possess a comprehensive understanding of the Argentine CLU regulations. Second, they should meticulously review the application against these regulations, identifying any discrepancies or omissions. Third, if deficiencies are found, they should consult the relevant administrative procedures to determine the appropriate course of action, which typically involves notifying the applicant of the missing information and providing a reasonable timeframe for correction. Fourth, they must document all steps taken and decisions made throughout the process. This ensures transparency, accountability, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. Question 12. Upon reviewing an applicant's request for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina, you discover that a previous application submitted by the same individual was marked as incomplete due to missing documentation related to psychological evaluation. The applicant states they were told the permit was almost approved at that time and wishes to proceed with the current application without resubmitting the psychological evaluation, believing it is no longer necessary. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Proceed with the current application, assuming the previous incomplete submission was a minor oversight and that the applicant will eventually provide the missing information if requested. Option B. Accept the applicant's assertion that the previous application was almost approved and proceed with the current application based on this unverified claim, without requiring a new psychological evaluation. Option C. Advise the applicant that a complete and current psychological evaluation, as per RENAR regulations, is mandatory for the current application and guide them on how to obtain and submit the required documentation. Option D. Advise the applicant to resubmit the same incomplete documentation from the previous application, hoping it will be overlooked this time. The correct answer is C. Advise the applicant that a complete and current psychological evaluation, as per RENAR regulations, is mandatory for the current application and guide them on how to obtain and submit the required documentation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements of the Argentine Firearms Registry, RENAR, for obtaining a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, while dealing with a potentially incomplete or misleading prior application. The challenge lies in ensuring full compliance with the law, preventing the issuance of a permit to someone who may not meet the criteria, and maintaining the integrity of the firearms registry. The professional must balance assisting the applicant with their responsibilities to public safety and regulatory adherence. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously verifying all submitted documentation against the current requirements stipulated by RENAR for a CLU. This includes confirming the applicant's identity, age, mental and physical fitness, and absence of criminal records or disqualifying conditions as per Argentine law. If the prior application was incomplete or contained errors, the professional must guide the applicant to rectify these issues and resubmit a complete and accurate application. This approach ensures that the permit is issued only to individuals who demonstrably meet all legal prerequisites, upholding the spirit and letter of Argentine firearms legislation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the current application, assuming the previous incomplete submission was a minor oversight and that the applicant will eventually provide the missing information. This fails to adhere to the principle of complete and accurate application submission mandated by RENAR, potentially leading to the issuance of a CLU to an unqualified individual. It bypasses the essential verification steps required by law. Another incorrect approach is to advise the applicant to simply resubmit the same incomplete documentation, hoping it will be overlooked. This is a direct violation of regulatory requirements, as RENAR mandates a thorough and complete application process. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the legal framework governing firearms permits in Argentina. A further incorrect approach is to accept the applicant's assertion that the previous application was approved despite being incomplete, and to proceed based on this unverified claim. This relies on hearsay rather than official documentation and verification, which is contrary to the rigorous standards required for firearms licensing. It risks legitimizing a potentially flawed prior process and issuing a permit without proper due diligence. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic decision-making framework. This begins with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements of RENAR for a CLU. Next, they must critically evaluate all submitted information, identifying any discrepancies or omissions. The core of the decision-making process involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and public safety. If an application is incomplete or contains errors, the professional's duty is to inform the applicant of the deficiencies and guide them towards rectifying these issues according to the established legal procedures. This ensures that decisions are based on verified facts and adherence to the law, rather than assumptions or shortcuts. Question 13. When evaluating an applicant's eligibility for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU in Argentina, what is the most appropriate course of action regarding the applicant's medical and psychological fitness documentation? Option A. Accept medical certificates that are generally positive about the applicant's health, even if they are slightly outdated, as long as the applicant claims to feel well. Option B. Ensure the applicant provides all legally mandated, up-to-date documentation from certified professionals that accurately reflects their current mental and physical state, and that they meet all explicit legal requirements for firearm ownership in Argentina. Option C. Allow the applicant to submit a self-declaration of good mental and physical health without requiring specific professional assessments, provided they have no prior criminal record. Option D. Advise the applicant to omit any mention of past psychological consultations or treatments to avoid potential complications with the application process. The correct answer is B. Ensure the applicant provides all legally mandated, up-to-date documentation from certified professionals that accurately reflects their current mental and physical state, and that they meet all explicit legal requirements for firearm ownership in Argentina. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for obtaining a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina, which involves demonstrating not only the physical capacity, but also the psychological and ethical suitability to possess a firearm. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting information can lead to denial of the permit, legal repercussions, and a failure to uphold public safety standards. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing and presenting the applicant's fitness according to Argentine law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and honest self-assessment by the applicant, ensuring all submitted documentation accurately reflects their current mental and physical state, and that they meet all explicit legal requirements for firearm ownership in Argentina, as stipulated by the relevant national laws and regulations governing the CLU. This approach prioritizes transparency and adherence to the legal framework, which is paramount for responsible firearm ownership and public safety. It directly addresses the intent of the law, which is to ensure only suitable individuals are granted permits. Incorrect approaches analysis. Submitting incomplete or outdated medical certificates, even if the applicant believes they are generally fit, fails to meet the explicit documentation requirements of the Argentine regulatory framework for the CLU. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and adherence to the prescribed legal process, potentially leading to an incomplete assessment of the applicant's suitability. Failing to disclose a history of psychological treatment, even if the applicant believes they are now stable, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Argentine law requires full disclosure of any conditions that could impact the safe handling and possession of firearms. Concealing such information undermines the integrity of the application process and poses a risk to public safety, violating the spirit and letter of the CLU regulations. Providing vague or generalized statements about mental and physical fitness without supporting documentation or specific attestations from qualified professionals, as required by Argentine law for the CLU, is insufficient. The regulatory framework demands concrete evidence of suitability, not mere assertions. This approach bypasses the necessary verification steps mandated by the law. Professional reasoning. Professionals evaluating CLU applications in Argentina should adopt a framework that emphasizes meticulous adherence to legal requirements, thorough documentation, and absolute honesty. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal criteria for CLU eligibility in Argentina, including medical, psychological, and background checks. 2. Requiring applicants to provide all mandated documentation from certified professionals. 3. Verifying the accuracy and completeness of all submitted information. 4. Prioritizing public safety and responsible firearm ownership above all else. Any deviation from these principles risks compromising the integrity of the permit system and public trust. Question 14. The analysis reveals that an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina has disclosed past involvement in several domestic disputes, none of which resulted in criminal convictions. Considering the regulatory framework for CLU issuance in Argentina, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with public safety obligations and the law? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and resolution of each domestic dispute, consulting relevant records and potentially requiring further information from the applicant to assess their overall suitability and adherence to good conduct requirements. Option B. Consider the domestic disputes irrelevant to the CLU application as long as no criminal charges were filed. Option C. Automatically deny the CLU application based on the mere mention of domestic disputes, regardless of their outcome or the applicant's current behavior. Option D. Accept the applicant's self-reported information about the disputes at face value and proceed with the application without further verification. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and resolution of each domestic dispute, consulting relevant records and potentially requiring further information from the applicant to assess their overall suitability and adherence to good conduct requirements. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina has a history of domestic disputes. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's right to own firearms with the paramount public safety concerns and the specific requirements of Argentine firearm legislation. The assessment must be thorough, objective, and adhere strictly to the legal framework governing CLU issuance, particularly concerning the applicant's suitability and potential risk. Correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation, coupled with a detailed investigation into the applicant's background, specifically focusing on any reported incidents of domestic violence or behavior that could indicate a propensity for violence. This includes verifying the nature and resolution of past disputes, consulting relevant databases, and potentially requiring additional documentation or interviews as permitted by law. This approach is correct because Argentine law, as outlined in Decree 2538/93 and subsequent regulations, mandates that applicants for a CLU must demonstrate good conduct and not pose a risk to themselves or others. The presence of domestic disputes, even if not resulting in criminal convictions, can be a significant indicator of potential unsuitability, requiring careful scrutiny to ensure compliance with the spirit and letter of the law, prioritizing public safety. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the domestic disputes as irrelevant if no criminal charges were filed. This fails to acknowledge that Argentine firearm regulations consider good conduct broadly, encompassing more than just criminal convictions. Such an approach risks overlooking behavioral patterns that could indicate a future risk, thereby violating the regulatory requirement to assess overall suitability and potentially endangering public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the permit solely based on the mention of domestic disputes without a thorough investigation. A caution is warranted. An automatic denial without due process or a comprehensive assessment of the specific circumstances and their resolution would be procedurally unfair and may not align with the nuanced requirements of the law, which allows for assessment of individual circumstances. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the applicant's self-reported information regarding the disputes without independent verification. This is insufficient because the law requires an objective assessment of suitability, and self-reporting may not provide a complete or unbiased picture of past events. Independent verification is crucial to ensure the accuracy of information and to make an informed decision based on reliable evidence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough, evidence-based assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements for CLU issuance in Argentina, including the definition of good conduct. 2. Conducting a comprehensive background check that goes beyond superficial information, actively seeking details about any reported incidents. 3. Objectively evaluating all gathered information, considering the nature, frequency, and resolution of any disputes. 4. Applying the legal criteria consistently and fairly, making a determination based on whether the applicant demonstrably meets the standards of suitability and poses no undue risk. 5. Documenting the entire process and the rationale for the final decision meticulously. Question 15. Comparative studies suggest that when evaluating applications for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina, what is the most professionally sound and legally compliant course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation and the applicant's background, strictly adhering to the provisions of Argentine National Arms Registry, RENAR, regulations and relevant provincial laws governing firearm permits, to determine if all statutory requirements for suitability are met. Option B. Deny the permit based on generalized concerns about increased crime rates in the applicant's neighborhood, irrespective of the applicant's individual background or any specific evidence of threat. Option C. Grant the permit immediately upon receiving the application, without conducting any required background checks or verifying the submitted information. Option D. Request additional, non-statutory documentation or interviews from the applicant without a clear, documented justification based on specific red flags identified during the initial review. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation and the applicant's background, strictly adhering to the provisions of Argentine National Arms Registry, RENAR, regulations and relevant provincial laws governing firearm permits, to determine if all statutory requirements for suitability are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Firearms Licensing Authority in Argentina to balance public safety with the rights of an individual seeking to obtain a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU. The authority must meticulously assess the applicant's suitability, ensuring compliance with all legal requirements while avoiding arbitrary or discriminatory decisions. The potential for misuse of firearms necessitates a rigorous and objective evaluation process. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and impartial review of all submitted documentation and the applicant's background, strictly adhering to the provisions of Argentine National Arms Registry, RENAR, regulations and relevant provincial laws governing firearm permits. This approach prioritizes objective evidence and established legal criteria. It ensures that the decision is based on whether the applicant meets all statutory requirements for physical, psychological, and legal suitability, as mandated by Argentine law, without introducing subjective biases or external pressures. This aligns with the principle of due process and the legal framework designed to regulate firearm ownership responsibly. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves denying the permit solely based on a generalized concern about increased crime rates in the applicant's neighborhood, without any specific evidence linking the applicant to criminal activity or demonstrating a direct threat to public safety posed by this particular individual. This is a failure to apply objective legal standards and instead relies on broad, unsubstantiated generalizations, potentially leading to discriminatory outcomes and violating the applicant's rights. Another incorrect approach is to grant the permit immediately upon receiving the application, without conducting any of the required background checks or verifying the submitted information. This bypasses crucial safety protocols established by RENAR and provincial legislation, creating a significant risk to public safety by failing to ensure the applicant is a legitimate and responsible user of firearms. A further incorrect approach is to request additional documentation or interviews that are not explicitly required by RENAR regulations or provincial law for a standard CLU application, without a clear and documented justification based on specific red flags identified during the initial review. This can be seen as an arbitrary imposition of additional burdens, potentially delaying or unfairly preventing an otherwise qualified applicant from obtaining their permit and deviating from the established legal process. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the applicable Argentine federal and provincial laws and RENAR regulations. This framework should emphasize objective evidence gathering, impartial assessment against defined legal criteria, and thorough documentation of every step. When faced with ambiguity or potential concerns, professionals should consult the relevant legal statutes and internal guidelines for clarification, rather than relying on personal judgment or external pressures. The process must be transparent, fair, and consistently applied to all applicants. Question 16. The investigation demonstrates that an applicant for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina has a documented history of domestic disputes. Considering the regulatory framework for firearms permits in Argentina, which of the following actions represents the most appropriate and legally compliant response? Option A. Rely solely on the applicant's self-reported information regarding the domestic disputes and proceed with the CLU application without independent verification. Option B. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature, context, and resolution of the domestic disputes to assess the applicant's current suitability and adherence to good conduct requirements before making a decision on the CLU application. Option C. Approve the CLU application without further investigation, assuming that past domestic disputes are irrelevant if they did not lead to criminal convictions. Option D. Automatically deny the CLU application upon discovering any mention of domestic disputes in the applicant's background, regardless of the specifics or outcomes. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature, context, and resolution of the domestic disputes to assess the applicant's current suitability and adherence to good conduct requirements before making a decision on the CLU application. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where an applicant for a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego, CLU, in Argentina has a history of domestic disputes. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's right to apply for a permit with the paramount public safety concerns and the specific requirements of Argentine firearms legislation. The assessment must be thorough, objective, and adhere strictly to the legal framework governing CLU issuance, particularly regarding the applicant's suitability and any potential risks. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation and a thorough background check, specifically investigating the nature and resolution of the domestic disputes. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible firearms ownership and the mandate of the RENAR, Registro Nacional de Armas, to ensure that only individuals who meet the legal requirements and pose no undue risk are granted a CLU. Argentine law, through decrees and resolutions governing firearms, emphasizes the applicant's capacity and suitability, which includes a clean record concerning violence or threats to public order. The investigation into past disputes is crucial to determine if they indicate a propensity for violence or instability that would disqualify the applicant under Article 4, Inciso C, of Law 25/917 and its implementing regulations, which require the applicant to demonstrate good conduct and not present a danger. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the CLU based solely on the mention of domestic disputes, without a detailed investigation into their specifics. This fails to adhere to the principle of due process and the requirement for evidence-based decision-making. The law does not mandate automatic disqualification for any mention of disputes, but rather for circumstances that demonstrate unsuitability or a risk. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the CLU without any further inquiry, assuming that past disputes are irrelevant if they did not result in criminal convictions. This overlooks the broader mandate of the RENAR to assess an applicant's overall suitability and potential risk, which can be indicated by non-criminal but concerning patterns of behavior. The legislation requires an assessment of good conduct, which extends beyond mere absence of criminal convictions. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the applicant's self-reporting of the disputes without independent verification. This would be a failure to conduct a diligent investigation, potentially allowing individuals who pose a risk to obtain firearms due to incomplete information. The professional decision-making process should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This includes 1. Identifying all relevant legal requirements for CLU issuance in Argentina. 2. Gathering all available information, including documentation and background checks. 3. Objectively evaluating the information, paying close attention to any red flags such as domestic disputes, and investigating their context and resolution. 4. Applying the legal criteria to the evaluated information to determine suitability. And 5. Documenting the entire process and the rationale for the final decision. Question 17. Analysis of an applicant's request for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina reveals they are a self-employed artisan who states they require a firearm for personal protection due to the nature of their work in remote areas. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firearms registry official? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's background. Verify their stated need for personal protection in remote areas through supporting documentation or inquiries where legally permissible, and assess their suitability against all established legal criteria for CLU issuance in Argentina. Option B. Request the applicant to provide evidence of specific threats or incidents that have occurred, and if none can be provided, deny the CLU on the grounds that a generalized fear of crime is insufficient justification. Option C. Deny the CLU, citing a general concern that individuals in artistic professions are not typically associated with the need for firearms, and that personal protection is not a primary criterion for CLU issuance. Option D. Immediately approve the CLU based on the applicant's self-declaration of needing personal protection for their work, as the law generally permits firearms for self-defense. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's background. Verify their stated need for personal protection in remote areas through supporting documentation or inquiries where legally permissible, and assess their suitability against all established legal criteria for CLU issuance in Argentina. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearms registry official in Argentina. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's stated need for a firearm with the legal requirements for obtaining and maintaining a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo, Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU. The official must critically evaluate the applicant's justification for firearm ownership, ensuring it aligns with the spirit and letter of Argentine law, particularly regarding public safety and responsible firearm possession. A superficial review could lead to the issuance of a permit to an individual who may not fully meet the criteria, while an overly stringent or misapplied interpretation could unjustly deny a lawful applicant. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective assessment of the applicant's stated purpose for firearm ownership, cross-referencing it with the specific requirements and limitations outlined in Argentine National Registry of Arms of the Argentine Republic (RENAR) regulations, which govern the CLU. This approach necessitates verifying the applicant's declared activities, e.g., sport shooting, hunting, collection, and ensuring they are legitimate and supported by evidence where required by law. The official must confirm that the applicant meets all personal suitability criteria, including mental and physical fitness, and has no disqualifying criminal record or history of violence, as mandated by Argentine law. This rigorous, evidence-based evaluation ensures compliance with the law and upholds public safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to grant the CLU solely based on the applicant's self-declaration of intent, without any independent verification or consideration of potential risks. This fails to adhere to the precautionary principle embedded in firearm regulation, which requires due diligence to prevent firearms from falling into the wrong hands, bypasses the legal obligation to assess suitability and legitimate need, potentially contravening RENAR regulations designed to ensure responsible ownership. Another incorrect approach is to deny the CLU based on a subjective interpretation of the applicant's perceived personality or a generalized fear of firearms, without any specific legal grounds or evidence of unsuitability. This constitutes an arbitrary decision, exceeding the official's authority and failing to apply the established legal criteria for CLU issuance. Such an approach undermines the fairness and impartiality expected of public officials and disregards the applicant's legal rights. A further incorrect approach involves focusing exclusively on the applicant's stated profession, without adequately assessing their specific reasons for wanting a firearm for that profession. For instance, if the profession involves potential risks, the official must still verify if a firearm is a necessary and legally permissible tool for that specific role, rather than assuming it is automatically justified or automatically unjustified. This demonstrates a failure to conduct a nuanced, case-by-case analysis as required by the regulatory framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, public safety, and fairness. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements for CLU issuance in Argentina, including all documentation and suitability criteria. 2. Objectively evaluating all submitted information and seeking clarification or additional evidence when necessary. 3. Applying the law consistently and impartially, without personal bias. 4. Documenting the decision-making process thoroughly, including the rationale for approval or denial, to ensure accountability and transparency. Question 18. Consider a scenario where an applicant for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina has disclosed on their application form that they have been involved in several domestic disputes in the past 5 years, though no criminal charges were filed. What is the most appropriate course of action for the RENAR, Registro Nacional de Armas, to take? Option A. Approve the application without further inquiry, assuming that the absence of criminal charges means the disputes are not a disqualifying factor. Option B. Immediately deny the application based on the mention of domestic disputes, as this indicates a potential risk to public safety. Option C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and resolution of the disclosed domestic disputes, potentially requesting supporting documentation or official records. Before making a decision on the permit application, Option D. Request a simple written statement from the applicant confirming that the disputes are resolved and pose no ongoing risk, and then approve the application. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and resolution of the disclosed domestic disputes, potentially requesting supporting documentation or official records before making a decision on the permit application. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to navigate a complex regulatory process with potentially serious consequences for noncompliance. The applicant's personal circumstances, specifically their history of domestic disputes, directly impact their eligibility for a legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina. The responsible authority must balance the applicant's right to apply with the paramount public safety concerns inherent in firearm ownership. A failure to thoroughly investigate or a misinterpretation of the regulations could lead to an unsafe individual possessing a firearm, or conversely, an unjustified denial of a permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough and objective review of the applicant's submitted documentation, coupled with a diligent investigation into the reported domestic disputes. This includes verifying the nature and resolution of these disputes through official records and potentially requesting further clarification or documentation from the applicant. The RENAR, Registro Nacional de Armas, regulations in Argentina are clear that any history of domestic violence or disputes that indicate a risk to public safety can be grounds for denial or revocation of a CLU. Therefore, a comprehensive assessment that prioritizes public safety by investigating all relevant information is the correct and legally mandated procedure. This approach ensures compliance with Article 11 of Law 25/917 and its implementing decrees, which emphasize the applicant's suitability and the absence of factors that compromise public safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the permit based solely on the mention of domestic disputes without further investigation. This fails to adhere to due process and the principle of assessing individual circumstances. The regulations require an evaluation of the nature and resolution of such disputes, not an automatic disqualification. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the permit without acknowledging or investigating the reported domestic disputes. This demonstrates a severe lapse in due diligence and a disregard for public safety, directly contravening the spirit and letter of the firearm regulations in Argentina, which aim to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of individuals who may pose a risk. A third incorrect approach would be to request only a self-declaration from the applicant about the domestic disputes without independently verifying the information or seeking official records. While a self-declaration is part of the process, it is insufficient when red flags like domestic disputes are raised, as it does not provide objective evidence of the applicant's current suitability. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic decision-making framework. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements of Argentina regarding CLU applications, particularly concerning factors that affect suitability. 2. Objectively evaluating all submitted documentation. 3. Identifying potential risk factors, such as reported domestic disputes. 4. Conducting thorough investigations to verify and contextualize any identified risk factors, utilizing official records, and requesting further information as needed. 5. Making a decision based on a comprehensive assessment of the applicant's suitability and the potential risk to public safety, in strict accordance with the law. This process ensures fairness to the applicant while upholding the primary objective of public safety. Question 19. During the evaluation of an individual's legitimate user of firearms permit, Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego CLU, in Argentina, a permit holder who has recently transitioned from a stable, long-term job in the public sector to self-employment as a freelance graphic designer, needs to understand the implications for their CLU. What is the most prudent course of action to ensure continued compliance with Argentine firearm regulations? Option A. Wait until the scheduled renewal date for their CLU to declare the change in employment, believing it will be addressed during the standard renewal process. Option B. Immediately contact the relevant Argentine authority responsible for firearm permits to inquire about the specific documentation and procedures required to update their CLU information based on their new employment status. Option C. Seek advice from an online forum dedicated to firearm enthusiasts in Argentina to understand how others have handled similar employment changes. Option D. Assume that as long as they can still afford their firearm and ammunition, the change in employment type will not affect their CLU validity. The correct answer is B. Immediately contact the relevant Argentine authority responsible for firearm permits to inquire about the specific documentation and procedures required to update their CLU information based on their new employment status. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the complexities of firearm ownership regulations in Argentina, specifically concerning the legitimate user of firearms permit clue. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the impact of a change in personal circumstances on the validity and renewal requirements of the CLU, ensuring compliance with the law to avoid legal repercussions and maintain lawful firearm possession. The individual must demonstrate due diligence and proactive engagement with the regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking official guidance from the relevant Argentine authority responsible for firearm permits, e.g., RENAR or its successor, regarding the specific implications of the change in employment status on the CLU. This approach is correct because it prioritizes direct, authoritative information. Argentine law, particularly Decree 2538/15 and its amendments, mandates that the applicant must meet and maintain specific requirements, including demonstrating suitability and lawful means of subsistence, which can be impacted by employment changes. Directly consulting the issuing authority ensures the individual receives accurate, up-to-date information tailored to their situation, thereby guaranteeing compliance with the legal framework governing CLU holders. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a change in employment status has no impact on the CLU, especially if the new employment is in a field not directly related to firearms. This is a regulatory failure because the CLU application and renewal process requires ongoing assessment of the applicant's suitability, which includes their socio-economic situation and lawful means of subsistence. Failing to verify this could lead to the permit being invalidated. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on informal advice from friends or other firearm owners. This is an ethical and regulatory failure because such advice is not official, may be outdated, or may not accurately reflect the specific nuances of Argentine firearm law. The CLU is a legal document with strict requirements, and informal guidance does not provide the necessary legal certainty or protection against potential penalties. A further incorrect approach is to wait until the CLU renewal period to address the employment change, hoping it will not be an issue. This is a significant regulatory failure. The law implies a continuous obligation to meet the requirements for holding a CLU. Any substantial change that could affect suitability or lawful means of subsistence should be reported or clarified promptly, rather than deferred. This delay could be interpreted as a lack of diligence and could result in complications during the renewal process or even immediate revocation if discovered. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with regulated permits, such as the CLU in Argentina, must adopt a proactive and diligent approach. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the fundamental requirements of the permit as outlined in the relevant legislation, e.g. Law 20,428 and its implementing decrees. 2. Recognizing that personal circumstances can impact eligibility. 3. Prioritizing official channels for information and clarification when in doubt or when significant changes occur. 4. Documenting all communications and actions taken to ensure a clear record of compliance. This systematic approach minimizes risk and ensures adherence to the legal and ethical obligations associated with firearm ownership. Question 20. Research into the financial requirements for obtaining a Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU) in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina, indicates that a firearm costs ARS 150,000. The provincial registration fee is ARS 15,000, and the federal processing fee is ARS 10,000. If the applicant opts to pay in 3 equal monthly installments, what is the correct calculation for the monthly installment amount to be declared? Option A, Rs 50,000. Option B, Rs 53,333.33. Option C, Rs 5,000.00. Option D, Rs 57,666.67. The correct answer is D, Rs 57,666.67. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearms permit applicant in Argentina due to the requirement to accurately calculate and report the total cost of firearm acquisition, including associated fees, within a specific time frame. Miscalculation or misrepresentation can lead to permit denial, delays, and potential legal repercussions. The core of the challenge lies in the applicant's responsibility to understand and apply the relevant financial regulations and fee structures stipulated by Argentine law for the Credencial de Legítimo Usuario de Armas de Fuego (CLU). The best approach involves meticulously calculating the total expenditure by summing the base price of the firearm, the provincial registration fee, and the federal processing fee, then dividing this sum by the number of installments to determine the correct monthly payment. This method ensures compliance with the CLU application requirements by accurately reflecting the financial commitment. Specifically, Article 30 of Decree 395/75, Reglamentario de la Ley Nacional de Armas y Explosivos 20,429, and subsequent resolutions by the ANMAC, Agencia Nacional de Materiales Controlados, mandate the declaration of all acquisition costs and the financial means to sustain firearm ownership. Accurate financial reporting is a cornerstone of responsible firearm ownership and a prerequisite for obtaining and maintaining a CLU. An incorrect approach would be to only consider the base price of the firearm when calculating the monthly installment, ignoring the provincial and federal fees. This fails to account for the total cost of acquisition as required by ANMAC regulations, potentially leading to an underestimation of financial capacity and a misrepresentation of the applicant's financial commitment. Another incorrect approach would be to divide only the provincial registration fee by the number of installments, neglecting both the firearm's base price and the federal processing fee. This is fundamentally flawed as it does not represent the overall financial outlay for acquiring the firearm. Finally, an approach that divides the sum of the firearm's base price and the federal processing fee by the number of installments, while partially correct, omits the provincial registration fee, thus still failing to present a complete and accurate financial picture as mandated by the CLU application process. Professionals should approach such situations by thoroughly reviewing all applicable ANMAC regulations and provincial decrees related to firearm acquisition costs. They should then create a detailed breakdown of all expenses, ensuring each component is accounted for in the calculation. A step-by-step verification process, including cross-referencing fee schedules and consulting official ANMAC resources if ambiguity exists, is crucial for ensuring accuracy and compliance.